Welcome to the Cheating Confession Reddit channel. Today, I'm going to share with you a real-life cheating story. It will give you a better understanding of the issue of infidelity today and help you be more cautious when it comes to a cheating wife. Let's dive into this story together.
The echo of her heels, striking the polished floor, pierced the stillness, each step measured and authoritative. Peggy had a knack for commanding attention wherever she went, and tonight was no exception. She swept into the house like it was her stage, effortlessly drawing all focus to her presence. Her crimson dress clung to her figure impeccably, the air around her thick with the intoxicating trace of her perfume. That was how she returned that Saturday night. Hours past due, while I waited in the muted glow of a single lamp, a glass of whiskey lazily cradled in my hand. I didn't speak right away. Instead, I studied her. She stopped mid-step when she noticed me, and for a split second, an unspoken emotion flickered across her expression. Was it remorse? No, Peggy was far too composed for that. "Nicholas," she greeted me, her tone smooth and deliberate. "Why are you sitting here in the dark? You startled me." "I startled you?" I replied, my laugh dry and hollow as I swirled the whiskey in my glass. "You're late." She glanced toward the clock with feigned indifference. "It's not that late. I told you I was out with Sarah. Why do you always act like I'm breaking curfew?" There it was, that familiar tone designed to make me feel unreasonable, as if my concerns were the problem. She strode past me, slipping off her heels. My eyes caught a faint smudge of lipstick on her jaw, not the shade she had on when she left. "Where were you really?" My voice remained unsettlingly calm. She faltered for the briefest moment before tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "I already told you," she said, her reply crisp and unwavering. I didn't let up. "Then why did Sarah call an hour ago asking where you were?" The silence that followed was heavy. That was the first crack in her composure. I hadn't actually spoken to Sarah, but Peggy didn't know that. I'd cast the line, and she bit. Her brow knitted slightly. "What are you talking about?" I rose slowly, keeping my tone steady. "If you were with Sarah, why did she text me at midnight, wondering where you were?" Her posture stiffened, her throat bobbing as she swallowed. But she was quick. Too quick. "You're impossible," she shot back, her voice tinged with irritation. "I went to the bar next door for 20 minutes. She probably left early and panicked. Why are you making this into something it's not?" The explanation rolled off her tongue smoothly, but I caught something, a subtle whiff of cologne lingering on her dress. It was expensive, unfamiliar, and definitely not mine. I didn't press further, not then. She stormed upstairs, muttering about how unreasonable I was, but her lie had set something in motion, a shift I couldn't ignore. The next day, an invitation arrived for a party at Sarah's house. It was the kind of chaotic event Peggy thrived on. Boisterous, alcohol-soaked, and crowded. She was insistent that we attend. "It'll be fun, Nicholas," she said, her smile radiant and disarming, as though nothing had transpired the night before. "We need this." I agreed, not out of a desire to enjoy myself, but because I needed answers. We arrived at Sarah's around 8, and as expected, Peggy quickly vanished into the throng. I lingered near the kitchen, nursing a beer and keeping a careful eye on the room. Laughter echoed around me, strangers flirted and conversations buzzed. But I never stopped watching her. About an hour later, I spotted her reflection in a window. She stood across the room, her fingers flying over her phone, her eyes flickering between the hallway and the back door, as though anticipating someone's arrival. I stayed rooted in place, waiting. Eventually, she slipped outside. I gave her 5 minutes before following. The chill in the night air hit me as I stepped into the yard, which was dimly lit by strings of soft fairy lights. Her laugh reached me first, quiet, intimate, coming from behind the tall bushes that shielded the far edge of the yard. That's when I saw them. Peggy stood far too close to a man I didn't recognize. Her hand rested lightly on his chest, her body leaning toward his as she beamed up at him with a smile that once belonged to me. He murmured something in her ear, and she laughed again before their lips met. I froze. My heart pounded so loudly it drowned out everything else. The beer bottle slipped from my grasp, landing with a muffled thud. Peggy pulled back abruptly, her eyes wide with panic as she scanned the yard. The man turned, his expression confused. I didn't give them a chance to explain. Without a word, I turned and walked back through the house, leaving her behind. Peggy didn't come home that night. At 9 the next morning, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, there she stood. Peggy. Her makeup was smudged, her eyes swollen and red. Tears streamed down her face, falling onto her trembling hands as she clutched her phone like it was her lifeline. "Nicholas," she croaked, her voice cracking. "Please, let me explain." She stood on the porch, shivering, her expression pleading. I remained still, silent, blocking her path like a stone sentinel. "Please," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Her sobs began softly, delicate at first, almost calculated. I had seen her cry before, after grueling shifts at the hospital, or when things didn't go as planned. But this was different. Was it her desperation or mine? I couldn't tell. I left her shivering in the icy air for what felt like forever, before I finally stepped aside. Even then, I made sure there was no chance for her to brush against me as she walked in, though I could feel her gaze silently pleading to meet mine. Inside, nothing had changed since last night. The whiskey bottle still sat half empty on the table. The glass was untouched, exactly where I'd left it. Peggy noticed immediately. Her lips quivered, as though she'd stumbled upon the wreckage of some personal tragedy. "You didn't sleep," she said softly. Her tone weighted with a concern she no longer had the right to express. "Sit down." My voice came out harsher than intended, uneven and raw. I didn't care if it betrayed me. Peggy obeyed without a word. She perched stiffly on the edge of the couch, her whole body taut as though bracing for a verdict. Her hands trembled as she wiped at her streaked makeup, but the smudges remained, damning evidence she couldn't erase. I stayed on my feet. "Who is he?" I asked at last, slicing through the suffocating silence. Her eyes widened, startled, and she stared up at me. Her lips parted, but no sound followed. She'd been caught, and I could see her mind racing, scrambling for an excuse, a lifeline. "Nigel," she mumbled at last. "It's not what you think." "Oh? And what exactly do I think?" My voice cut like a whip, sharp enough to make her flinch. "Do you think I'm an idiot, Peggy? Do you think I didn't notice?" Her face turned ashen. She opened her mouth to respond, but no explanation came. "I was there," I said, my tone unwavering. "I saw you. I saw you kiss him." Her complexion drained completely, leaving her looking like a ghost. Her lips trembled, but she stayed silent. "You're going to tell me everything," I demanded, my voice low but laced with restrained fury. "Who he is, how long this has been happening, why you thought it was okay to do this to me, then come home and cry like you're the victim." Her tears fell again, jagged and uncontrolled. "Nicholas," she choked out, "please, I made a mistake." I let out a bitter laugh, sharp and unforgiving. "A mistake? Forgetting your keys is a mistake. Burning dinner is a mistake. Kissing another man and disappearing all night is not a mistake, Peggy." Her sobs grew louder, her body shaking as she crumbled under the weight of my words. The woman I once adored was now reduced to this trembling, pitiful figure. Yet I felt no sympathy, only a desperate need for answers. "Start talking," I said quietly, my tone edged with steel, "or I'll start packing your things." Her hands fell to her lap, and something hardened in her tear-streaked face. Anger flickered in her eyes for the first time that morning. "You want the truth?" she spat, her voice cutting through her tears. "Fine. You want to know what's going on? You're what's going on." Her accusation landed like a slap. I blinked, stunned. "You sit here every night," she continued, her voice trembling with pent-up frustration, "with that laptop glued to your hands until the early hours. You're never here, Nicholas. You don't see me. You don't care about what I'm feeling or what I need. You've turned into a stranger, and I'm supposed to just endure it?" The room seemed to spin. "So now this is my fault?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "I don't know," she yelled, her tears mingling with her fury. "Maybe it's both of us. Maybe we've been falling apart for months and you didn't even notice. Do you think this just happened? Do you think I wanted any of this?" Her words hit like a storm, relentless and destructive, tearing through the fragile remains of our connection. "You made a choice," I shot back, my voice rising. "You, Peggy, not me. I didn't kiss someone else. I didn't lie. Don't you dare try to turn this into something it's not." "I didn't sleep with him," she screamed, her voice ringing out like a final blow. The room fell silent, her confession hanging heavily in the air. I stared at her, my chest heaving as I tried to process her words. "And I'm supposed to believe that?" I asked, my voice unsteady. She sank back against the couch, her energy drained. "Believe what you want, Nicholas," she whispered. "But I swear I didn't." I didn't know if she was lying. I wasn't sure it mattered anymore. "Who is he?" I asked again, quieter this time, my voice resigned. She hesitated, staring at her hands as if the answer might be etched into her skin. "His name is Nigel," she finally admitted. "Nigel," I repeated, the name bitter in my mouth. "And how long?" 3 months, she whispered. 3 months, 90 days, a quarter of a year. The revelation knocked the air out of me, and I collapsed into the armchair, putting as much space as possible between us. The truth weighed heavily, crushing me under its brutal clarity. For 3 months, my life had been a lie. Peggy's sobs softened, fading into quiet sniffles. She waited for me to speak, but I had nothing left to say. My mind was blank, overloaded. At last, I looked at her. "You need to leave." Her head snapped up, her face a mix of disbelief and sorrow. My voice was icy, nearly unrecognizable. "What did you just say?" "You heard me," she replied, her tone firm yet hollow. "Pack your things. Go stay with Sarah or Nigel, I don't care who." "Nicholas, please," she began, but I cut her off with a swift motion as I stood abruptly. "Leave this house," I commanded. "I need time. I need space. Right now I can't even bear to look at you." Her face crumpled, a pained mixture of remorse and anguish, but I forced myself to stay unaffected. Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked out, leaving her to face the wreckage of what she'd done. As the bedroom door clicked shut behind me, one thought pounded in my head. How could a single moment, one careless decision, unravel everything we had built? The soft sound of the door closing behind me felt hollow, a sound that didn't carry the finality I craved. Through the thin walls, her muffled voice spilled out, pleading desperately, as though her words alone could mend what was irreparably broken. I stayed rooted in the bedroom, staring blankly at the disheveled bed, our bed. It felt alien now, as though it belonged to strangers. The emotions I expected, anger, heartbreak, even revulsion, refused to rise. What remained was a suffocating emptiness, an oppressive void that seemed to stretch endlessly. A sudden thump jolted me from my trance. Another followed, likely Peggy's frustrated movements as she packed her things into a bag. I didn't move to confront her. Instead, my gaze wandered to the framed wedding photo on the dresser. 6 years ago, bathed in the warm light of a setting sun, we had smiled at a future we believed unshakable. She had leaned her head on my shoulder, her joy radiant, her trust absolute. I picked up the frame, bile rising in my throat. That memory now felt like a cruel joke. The weight of it was unbearable. I turned the picture face down, but the image refused to leave my mind. Time seemed to crawl, and eventually, I heard the front door creak open. "Nicholas," her voice wavered, barely audible. "I'm leaving. I'll stay with Sarah." The silence stretched unbearably thin. She lingered, perhaps hoping I'd call her back, offer some shred of hope, or fight for what was left of us. I remained silent. Her defeated sigh filled the void, and the door clicked shut behind her. The sound was like the house exhaling, releasing tension it had held too long. The next day drifted by in a fog. I didn't eat or shower. I sat slumped on the couch while the television droned meaninglessly in the background. My mind, however, refused to relent, circling back to that moment in the yard, Peggy's hand resting on his chest. Nigel. A name and a vague silhouette were all I had, but the guilt in her voice, an almost confession, was damning enough. Desperation drove me to act. Her phone was gone, but the laptop we shared remained. What I did next filled me with shame, but pride had no place here. I combed through emails and messages, searching for answers. Then, I found it. "Can't wait to see you tonight. I'll slip out early. Nigel." The message, dated 3 weeks ago, was buried beneath mundane threads about grocery lists and work updates. Like a parasite hidden in plain sight, it had been there all along. I dug further, each discovery twisting the knife deeper. Hotel reservations, bars, lies about extra shifts at work. The betrayal unraveled, layer by agonizing layer. Slamming the laptop shut, I gripped the armrests of the couch, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The room felt like it was closing in on me, walls pressing tighter with every breath. I wanted to shout, to break something, but I stayed frozen, teeth clenched and jaw aching. 3 months. For 3 months she'd been deceiving me, sharing herself with someone whose face I couldn't even conjure. Somehow, that made it worse. Later, my phone buzzed. Peggy's name lit up the screen. I ignored it. When it buzzed again, a text followed. "Nicholas, please, I need to talk to you. I can explain everything." Her explanations earlier had been nothing but hollow excuses. I turned the phone off and tossed it aside. Staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spiraled uncontrollably. An hour later, sharp knocks on the door broke the silence. 3 quick raps that sent a jolt through me. Rising, I braced myself for another confrontation with Peggy. But it wasn't her. It was Sarah. "Nicholas," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. She had clearly chosen a side. Her arms were crossed, her dark hair pulled back tightly, her expression resolute. She looked like a judge about to deliver a verdict. "We need to talk." "Why are you here?" I demanded, my tone sharp. Her eyes scanned the room briefly, confirming Peggy wasn't there. She sighed, her shoulders dropping slightly. "Peggy's at my place. She's a mess. Won't stop crying. She begged me not to come, but someone had to." A bitter laugh escaped me. "Had to? And what exactly do you think you're going to accomplish here?" Sarah didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her voice lowering. "I know you're furious." "Furious?" My voice rose sharply. "Sarah, my wife cheated on me. Furious doesn't even begin to cover it." She shook her head. "You don't know the whole story. That's what Peggy keeps saying. And you know what? I'm done caring." "Nicholas, listen," Sarah pressed, her tone insistent. "It's not what you think." "I know about Nigel," I snapped, the name cutting through the air like a blade. "So why don't you enlighten me? What's left to know?" For the first time, she hesitated. Her determination faltered. Dropping her arms to her sides, she met my eyes. "Nigel isn't just some random guy," she said carefully, her words deliberate. "He's someone Peggy knew before she met you." Her statement hit like a punch to the gut. My chest tightened, and my pulse thundered in my ears. "What are you saying?" "I don't know everything," Sarah admitted, her voice softening but her gaze steady. And in that moment, the fractured pieces of my shattered life rearranged themselves, forming questions I wasn't sure I had the strength to face. He had been a part of her story, a chapter I thought had long since closed. I didn't even realize they had reconnected until recently. She assured me it was insignificant, just foolish lapses in judgment. Yet, there was Nigel. Her voice wavered and her face softened as though the weight of her own words was too much to bear. She was struggling, but so was I. This confrontation was inevitable. I could barely register her words, lost as I was in my spiraling thoughts while staring at Sarah. My fists clenched so tightly that my nails dug into my skin. Peggy's past, and Nigel, felt like a buried landmine, lying in wait for me to stumble across it. Sarah's voice became a distant hum, her words dissolving into the haze of my mounting anger. One thought roared above all else. What other secrets was she hiding? The weight of the revelation wasn't just the betrayal or the lies. It was the shattering realization that I had committed my life to someone I didn't truly know. After delivering this devastating truth, Sarah left, leaving the house unnervingly silent and my mind in turmoil. Nigel wasn't just a name from her past. He was someone who had been significant to Peggy before she and I ever exchanged vows. The thoughts circled me relentlessly, gnawing at my sense of reality. Her past, I had always assumed Peggy's history was just that. History. She'd never been secretive, yet there were parts of her life she never shared, and I never pressed for details. Perhaps that had been my mistake. Perched on the edge of the couch with my phone in hand, I stared at her name in my messages. A torrent of questions raced through my mind, and I hated that only she could answer them. The person who had broken my trust now held the answers I desperately sought. Before I could second-guess myself, I typed and sent the message. "Tell me about Nigel. Don't lie." Each minute that passed afterward felt unbearably long. When my phone buzzed, I nearly dropped it in my haste. Her response was brief. "Nicholas, please let me call you." I shot back another message. "Answer the question." The silence that followed was excruciating. Finally, her reply came. "We dated." The blood drained from my face as I stared at the screen. "Define dated," I replied, my fingers trembling. The next response took longer, and when it came, her words felt like jagged shards cutting into me. "We were serious for a while. He cheated on me. It ended badly, and I hadn't seen him again until a few months ago." Cheated. The irony struck me like a cruel joke. This was Nigel, the man who had once broken her, and now she had allowed him back into our lives like some malevolent ghost. I slammed the phone onto the coffee table, its screen lighting up with one final message. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Nicholas, I swear." Didn't mean for it to happen. The phrase sounded hollow, as though her choices had been out of her hands. I stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal, my thoughts spiraling further. Memories I had cherished began surfacing, now tainted. The first time Peggy said she loved me, the night I proposed, the day we bought this house together. What had once felt unshakable now seemed fragile, like illusions waiting to shatter. How many other parts of her life had been hidden from me? How much of what we had was real? Sleep eluded me that night. By the time I found myself in the kitchen, clutching my fourth glass of water, the house felt unnaturally still, as if it shared my unease. Then my phone buzzed again, a call from Peggy. I let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th, I picked up. "What?" My tone was cold, unyielding. Silence greeted me before I heard her unsteady breathing. "Nicholas," she began, her voice cracking. "I know you're furious, but you have to believe me. I didn't go looking for him." I remained silent, and she rushed to fill the void. "I ran into him at the coffee shop near the hospital. I hadn't seen him in years. At first I didn't even recognize him, but he recognized me." My throat felt dry. "And then what?" I asked bitterly. "You just picked up where you left off? Let the man who cheated on you slide back into your life?" Her breath hitched. "No, it wasn't like that. I didn't plan for this, Nicholas." "Didn't plan for this," I echoed bitterly. "Like your lips just accidentally met his at that party?" "I messed up," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I know I did, but it's more complicated than you think. Seeing him again, being near him, it made me question everything. I don't even know what's wrong with me." I stared at the darkened kitchen cabinets, gripping the phone so tightly I thought it might break. "What do you mean?" I demanded. "Question everything? Us?" Her hesitation was deafening. When she finally spoke, her voice was a fragile whisper. "I don't know." Those words shattered something deep within me. "You don't know?" I repeated, my tone as sharp as a blade. "You don't know if you love me anymore? After 7 years?" "Nicholas, she started, but I ended the call before she could finish. The next morning, I woke up on the couch, my neck stiff and my heart hollow. My phone buzzed repeatedly with missed calls and texts from Peggy. I ignored them all. By midday, I found myself at my brother Ryan's place. Ryan lived a few miles outside of town in a small rental that looked like it could fall apart at any moment. It wasn't much, but it was his, and it was quiet, exactly what I needed. When he opened the door and saw me, he shook his head with a knowing look and muttered, "You dumb fool." "You look like hell. Feeling any better?" I asked as I walked into the house. Ryan didn't bother responding, just handed me a beer when we reached the kitchen. No probing questions, no judgment. That was Ryan. He never pushed. He had this quiet way of waiting, letting you come undone at your own pace. It took me about 20 minutes of sitting in silence before I finally cracked. She cheated, I said flatly, eyes fixed on the beer label in my hands. 3 months, some guy from her past. Ryan whistled low under his breath. Damn. She swears they didn't sleep together. I don't even know if I believe her. I caught them at a party. Ryan leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. You think she's lying? I shook my head, slow and deliberate. It doesn't even matter anymore, does it? He stayed quiet, carefully choosing his words. So, what now? I exhaled sharply, the weight of the question crushing. I told her to leave. She's staying with Sarah for now. Keeps calling, saying she wants to fix things. Ryan studied me, his expression steady. Do you want to fix it? I met his gaze, my exhaustion palpable. How do you even begin to fix something like this? Ryan didn't answer. Neither did I. What I did know was this. Whatever Peggy and I once had, love, trust, certainty, was in pieces. Even if we managed to glue it all back together, the cracks would always show. The worst part? I couldn't decide whether I was angrier at her for breaking us, or at myself for still caring. No one warns you how betrayal worms its way into your mind, relentless and unforgiving. You don't sleep, because every time you close your eyes, you see them together. You don't eat, because your stomach churns at the thought of the lie you were living. Worst of all, you can't stop the questions, the endless loop of why and what if. The next few days passed in a fog. I barely left Ryan's battered old couch. He didn't pry, but I could feel his quiet concern. I wanted to get myself together, to claw my way out of this pit, but it felt like trying to move through quicksand. On the third day, Peggy called again. I answered, though I wasn't sure why. Closure, maybe, or some part of me hoping she'd crack, confess everything, and make my next move clear. Nicholas, she said softly, her voice hesitant, like she wasn't sure which version of me she'd find on the other end. I didn't respond, and she took the silence as permission to continue. I know you don't want to hear this, but I can't. I can't just let this be the end. I need to try. Her words hit harder than I wanted to admit. Try? I replied, my tone sharp and cold. Peggy, there hasn't been in us for months. You ended that the moment you let him back into your life. She let out a shaky breath. I made a mistake, Nicholas. One mistake. Stop calling it that, I snapped, gripping the phone tighter. This wasn't some accident, Peggy. You didn't trip and fall into his arms. You made choices. Choices to see him, to talk to him, to... I couldn't even finish the sentence. And now you think this is something we can fix with a conversation? Her silence was deafening. All I could hear was her unsteady breathing, like she was on the verge of tears. I'm sorry, she whispered. I don't know what else to say. I was confused. Confused? I barked out a bitter laugh. Confused about what, Peggy? Whether or not you wanted to destroy our marriage? Did you wake up one day and forget you were married to me? Or did you just not care? For a moment I thought she'd hung up, but then she spoke, her voice thin and fragile. I didn't go looking for him, Nicholas, but seeing him again, it brought back everything. Everything I felt before he hurt me, before it all fell apart. I don't even know why. Maybe I just needed to prove something to myself. Prove what? I demanded, every word cutting like a blade. That you still had his attention? That he still wanted you? Is that what this was about? No, she shouted, her voice breaking. It wasn't about him. It was about me. About everything I've been feeling slipping away. I love you, but I've been drowning. I can't explain it. Her admission hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me reeling. So your solution was to cheat on me? I didn't plan for this, she said quietly, like she hated the words as much as I did. You keep saying that, I murmured, almost to myself. Silence stretched between us, heavy with all the things left unsaid. I could hear her soft, broken sobs, but I felt nothing. Not sympathy, not pity, nothing. You don't get to cry, Peggy, I said, my voice cold and detached. You don't get to play the victim when you're the one who did this. I know, she whispered, her voice raw and ragged. I hate myself for it. Good, I replied flatly. The silence that followed was final, weighted with the gravity of everything we'd lost. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke again, her voice barely audible. "What happens now, Nicholas?" I didn't respond right away. I didn't know what to say. Everything felt like ashes, burnt beyond recognition. Finally, I managed to reply, my voice hollow. "I need time, and I need you to leave me alone." She didn't argue. She didn't beg. A shaky breath slipped from her lips before she whispered a soft, "All right." I didn't say another word as I ended the call. That night, Ryan found me on his porch, sitting alone under the night sky, staring into the darkness. The late hour brought a biting chill that cut through the air, but I felt none of it. Numbness had settled deep in my chest, silencing everything. The cold, the ache, even my thoughts. Just emptiness. Without a word, Ryan joined me, pressing a beer into my hand. He didn't try to fill the silence. We simply sat there in the stillness until he finally spoke, his voice steady and sure. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now. But whatever decision you make, it needs to be for you, not for her, not for anyone else." I barely nodded, my eyes fixed on the empty street. "I keep asking myself what I did wrong," I murmured, my voice cracking under the weight of my thoughts. What I missed, why I wasn't enough. Ryan turned toward me, his expression firm. "Don't do that to yourself," he said, his tone unyielding. "This isn't on you. She made her choices. Those are hers, not yours." "I know," I replied, though the words felt as hollow as I did. We stayed there for a while, the quiet pressing heavier with each passing minute. My mind wandered to Peggy, her tearful explanations, her attempts to justify it all, the years we'd spent together now shadowed by her betrayal. I had no answers for what came next. I didn't know if forgiveness was even possible, or if I wanted it to be. All I knew was that what we'd had was gone. Only echoes of it remained, like ash from a burned-out fire. The morning after Peggy's call, I woke up on Ryan's couch, my neck stiff and a blanket slipping off onto the floor. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, trying to pull myself together, but my thoughts refused to settle. Peggy's presence lingered in the air like a ghost I couldn't escape. Her voice, her face, the way she'd looked at me the last time we were together, it was all too vivid. By midday, I couldn't stand staying there anymore. The stillness of Ryan's apartment, once comforting, now felt suffocating. I needed to move, to break free from the spiral, so I decided to go back to the house. I hadn't returned since I told Peggy to leave. The thought of stepping inside filled me with dread, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. The drive felt interminable, every mile tightening the knot in my chest. By the time I pulled into the driveway, it felt like an invisible weight was pressing down on me. I stayed in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as I stared at the front door. The house looked the same, but it felt like a stranger's. The air inside was stagnant and lifeless as I walked through the living room, the sound of my footsteps faint against the hardwood floors. It was as though time had stopped the moment she left. Peggy's shoes were still by the door where she'd left them. A mug sat on the kitchen counter, abandoned mid-use, as though she might return at any moment. But she wouldn't. I wandered aimlessly through the house, feeling more like a visitor than someone who had once called it home. Eventually, I ended up at the bedroom door. My hand hesitated on the knob before I pushed it open. The bed was neatly made. That was the first thing I noticed. Peggy had taken the time to smooth the covers and arrange everything perfectly, as if that could somehow erase what had happened. I sank onto the edge of the bed, burying my face in my hands. The silence was so complete it roared in my ears. I don't know how long I sat there before my eyes drifted to her nightstand. A small red notebook peeked out from beneath a stack of books. My chest tightened. I recognized it. Peggy had always claimed it was for mundane notes, to-do lists, work reminders, grocery items. Nothing important, she'd said. But now, I wasn't sure I could believe her. My hands shook as I picked it up. The pages were soft, worn at the edges from frequent use. I flipped it open, hoping against hope for something innocent, something that would prove my fears unfounded. But on the third page, I saw his name, Nigel. The entry was short, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. I saw him again today, Nigel. I thought I'd forgotten his face, but the moment I saw him, it all came back. He smiled at me like no time had passed, and I felt alive. That's not fair to Nicholas. I know it's not, but I don't know how to stop feeling this way. I slammed the notebook shut so quickly it made a sharp snap. My pulse thundered in my ears as I gripped the cover, my knuckles whitening. Alive! That word echoed relentlessly in my mind, growing louder and sharper until it was unbearable. She felt alive with him? What did that make me? A lifeless burden? A cage she couldn't wait to escape? I stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor as I shoved the notebook back into the nightstand. My breathing was uneven as I stumbled into the living room and collapsed onto the couch. I tried to steady myself, but the betrayal cut too deep. It wasn't just her lies or the secrecy. It was the truth beneath it all, the truth of how she'd felt and how long she'd hidden it. Hours passed as the sun sank below the horizon. My phone buzzed, vibrating against the table. I didn't need to look to know it was Peggy. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity before I finally picked it up. This time my voice was drained of anger or accusation. It was empty. "What?" I asked, the single word carrying the weight of everything left unsaid. There was nothing more to argue, no more questions to ask, and somehow, that silence between us said it all. My phone vibrated, its hum slicing through the silence. A text from Ryan lit up the screen. "Let me know when you're ready to grab a drink and talk." I flipped the phone face down on the table and leaned back into the booth, sinking deeper into the solitude. My gaze wandered aimlessly until the waitress appeared, placing a slice of cherry pie before me. The aroma hit first, sweet and comforting. The crust gleamed golden, its delicate flakes threatening to crumble at the slightest touch. "Enjoy, hun," she said, her tone warm and familiar, reminiscent of my mother's gentle encouragements. For a fleeting moment, it felt like someone truly cared, urging me to eat, to stop looking so defeated. Later that evening, stepping into my house, I sensed something had shifted. The emptiness lingered, but it no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it carried the freshness of a room aired out after years of staleness. I dropped my keys onto the table and stood still, absorbing the unfamiliar quiet. My attention was drawn to the corner where Peggy's boxes used to be. Their absence left the space feeling open, almost breathable. Yet clearing the physical clutter only unearthed the emotional mess I'd been avoiding. I sank onto the edge of the couch, allowing the long-ignored questions to surface. Where had it all unraveled? Was it the relentless hours I spent at work? Her silent frustrations that went unspoken? The nights we shared the same space but were worlds apart, pretending everything was fine? For so long I had blamed her, never pausing to confront my own failings. Her choices weren't justifiable, that much I knew, but marriages don't disintegrate because of one person's missteps alone. They erode slowly, cracks forming over time until the slightest pressure breaks them apart. She once told me she felt like she was. The next morning, I woke with an unfamiliar determination. I threw myself into cleaning the house from top to bottom, purging everything that no longer served me, the clutter, the empty bottles, the remnants of a life that no longer fit. It wasn't a solution, but it felt like a beginning. For the first time in weeks, I grabbed my jacket, locked the door, and stepped into the crisp morning air. I didn't know where I was headed, but I knew one thing. This wouldn't break me. The life I'd known was gone. But maybe that meant I could build something new, one step at a time. Later, I wandered into a hardware store, aimlessly roaming the aisles. The decision to repaint the house came suddenly, but it felt right. If this space was to be mine again, it needed change, a transformation that mirrored my own. I loaded my cart with supplies I hadn't touched in years, sandpaper, paintbrushes, and cans of deep blue paint. No more beige, that had been Peggy's choice. This was for me. Back home, I pushed the furniture to the center of the living room, covered it with a sheet, and got to work. Each stroke of the paint roller felt cathartic, as though I were wiping away the ghosts of what had been. The beige walls disappeared under rich blue, a color that spoke of quiet nights and fresh starts. By the time I finished the first wall, my arms were aching, my shirt was streaked with paint, and sweat trickled down my back. I didn't stop. Loud, gritty music filled the room, drowning out my thoughts as I worked. At some point my phone buzzed, a text from Ryan. "Still alive? Haven't heard from you today." I smirked faintly as I replied, "Painting the house." His response was swift. "Painting? Who even are you? Bob the Builder?" "Something like that," I typed back. "Needed to make this place mine again." His reply was simple but struck a chord. "Proud of you. Keep going." 3 days later, the transformation was complete. The living room no longer resembled the space it had been. The dull beige walls were gone, replaced by deep blue that felt alive, full of promise. I was exhausted, my body sore from the effort, but for the first time in months, the house felt like mine. The walls were bare, no photos, no decorations, and that emptiness felt right. A clean slate. On the 4th day, Ryan showed up unannounced, 2 six-packs in hand. "You're persistent," I said, holding the door open for him. He kicked off his shoes and grinned. "You think I'm letting you mope forever? Let's see the masterpiece." I hesitated, suddenly self-conscious about the changes I'd poured myself into. But as Ryan looked around, his approving nod said everything I needed to hear. Ryan let out a soft whistle, his eyes sweeping across the room. "Man," he said, shaking his head with a mix of amazement and disbelief. "This doesn't even feel like the same place anymore." "That was kind of the goal," I replied, slipping my hands into my pockets. He flopped onto the couch and popped open a beer with a practiced flick of his wrist. "You know," he said, grinning, "most guys would have drowned their sorrows in a bottle of whiskey or splurged on something ridiculous like a sports car. But you've turned into some sort of DIY master. Drowning, and I had been too blind to see it." For the first time, regret seeped into the anger I'd been clinging to. That night I rummaged through the kitchen drawer, the one that held all the forgotten odds and ends. Amid the clutter of unpaid bills, broken pens, and crumpled takeout menus, I found it. A small envelope in Peggy's handwriting. It was a birthday card she had given me 2 months earlier. We'd argued that morning over something trivial, a leaky sink I'd neglected to fix, her impatient eye roll, and I'd shoved the card into the drawer, unopened, as a quiet act of defiance. Now the envelope felt heavier in my hands. Slowly I opened it. The front of the card bore a simple image of a mountain range and the words, "To many more adventures." Inside, her handwriting spilled across the page. "Nicholas, I know I'm not always easy to love. I'm stubborn, impatient, and I push when I shouldn't. But through it all, the fights, the rough days, you're still the person I want beside me. You make me feel safe. You make me feel seen. I'm so proud of the life we've built, even if I don't always say it. I love you. I love us. Happy birthday, Nicholas. Peggy." I placed the card on the table and stared at it until my vision blurred. That was the hardest part, knowing it had been real. The love, the connection, the foundation of what we'd built. None of it was a lie. But even that truth hadn't been enough to save us. And maybe, deep down, I knew it hadn't been enough to save me either. Rolling my eyes, I dropped into the chair across from him. "Cheaper than a therapist," I said with a shrug. Ryan took a slow sip of his beer, his expression shifting to something more serious as he studied me. "All jokes aside," he said after a moment, "how are you holding up? Like, really holding up?" I hesitated, letting my gaze wander to the freshly painted wall that had consumed hours of my time. "Better," I admitted after a beat. "I think. Still angry," I added. "And numb, sometimes. It's weird." "That's to be expected," Ryan said, his tone steady. "You don't just walk away from 7 years and feel fine overnight, but it doesn't mean you're not moving forward." I nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in his words. The burning anger I'd carried at first had dimmed over time, replaced by a dull, lingering ache. It felt like an old bruise, not sharp anymore, but still tender if pressed. I didn't miss Peggy in the way I'd once feared I would. What I missed was the idea of her, the vision of us as unbreakable, the life I'd thought we were building together. Sometimes, I murmured, my eyes dropping to the floor, I wonder if there was something I could have done differently. Like if I'd just paid more attention or spoken up earlier, maybe things wouldn't have fallen apart. Ryan shook his head firmly, his response immediate. "Don't do that to yourself," he said, leaning forward. His voice softened, but the conviction in it didn't waver. "Look, maybe there were cracks before Nigel came into the picture, but she's the one who chose to cheat, Nick. That's on her. Don't take her guilt and make it your burden." The weight of his words settled over me and I nodded, swallowing hard against the lump rising in my throat. "Besides," Ryan continued, a mischievous grin breaking through the seriousness, "you're already leagues ahead of most guys in your situation. Plenty of them would still be holed up in bed, crying over old wedding photos and polishing off a week's worth of takeout." I couldn't help but chuckle at that. "Glad to know the standards are so high," I shot back. He laughed with me, raising his beer in an exaggerated toast. "To fresh starts," he said, "whatever they end up looking like." I clinked my bottle against his, and for the first time in weeks, my smile felt real. Not forced, not an act, just genuine. After Ryan left, the quiet of the house wrapped around me, but instead of suffocating, it felt peaceful. I picked up my phone, scrolling through my contacts until Peggy's name appeared on the screen. My thumb hovered over it for a moment. I wasn't going to call her, not out of anger or spite. I didn't hate her, and I didn't miss her in the way I thought I might. Instead, I opened our old text thread and began typing a message I had no intention of sending. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Peggy. I'll be okay." I stared at the words for a moment before erasing them and setting the phone aside. She didn't need to hear that I was going to be fine. The only person who needed to know that was me. Standing up, I stretched and glanced around the room. There was still so much to do. Walls to finish painting, furniture to replace, memories to rebuild, but it was a start. Stepping onto the back porch, I settled on the wooden steps, letting the cool night air fill my lungs. Above me, the stars stretched out in quiet brilliance, tiny reminders that no matter how broken life feels, it keeps moving forward. And maybe, just maybe, so would I. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.